Before we get started here, we're going to go to Future Snipe Off in the field, and he will explain everything we did and why. Thanks, past Snipe Off. So this is after we did all the replacement on this 2004 Dodge 2500 Diesel. What we did is replace the fan clutch. Can't really see anything down here, but the fan clutch, water pump, belt idler, serpentine belt, belt tensioner, the accumulator, this AC line, the AC compressor, as well as the radiator. The reason we did all this is our AC stopped working, and the reason we believe it happened is the fan clutch also stopped working, which made it so that the fan never really engaged at full speed, and that caused the pressure in the AC system to build up, which eventually blew the pressure release on the back of the AC compressor. So that was the reason we did this whole replacement. So I'll send you back to past Snipe Off and he'll take it from there. Thanks, Future Snipe Off. Let's get started. A buddy and I will be narrating this whole process for you, and all the parts we bought and used on this project will be linked in the description below. So in this video we replaced the accumulator, one of the AC lines. The reason we replaced this particular AC line is because the expansion valve is located inside of it, and we were thinking it could have gotten clogged when our AC compressor failed. Here's the oil and O-rings for that. And we got a new condenser. Also, we replaced the AC compressor and the fan clutch.
We got a serpentine belt kit also. Brand spanking new belt. Look at that. Ooh. We also got a tensioner pulley. That should roll nice. We also got an idler pulley and a water pump.
You're also going to need about 30 ounces of R134A Freon, as well as this adapter to fit the cans.
So for this job, you won't need many specialty tools. Just a lot of sockets, some little wrenches. You won't need a pipe wrench either, but we got one. You'll need this little specialty AC line disconnect tool, and these ratcheting in wrenches are pretty handy.
First things first, you're going to want to disconnect your battery terminals. We disconnected all of them, and be sure you disconnect the negatives first.
Now we're going to remove the top cover of the airbox, unclip those clips, take the airbox off, wiggle it off, and then we loosen this little hose clamp to spin it out of the way.
So to get the battery out, you're going to need to loosen this little wedge piece. It's a 10mm bolt.
Wangle jangle that loose.
And then the battery will just slide right out
of its diaper. Okay, next up, we're going to pull the bottom half of the airbox out. First, take the filter out.
Then you're going to need to loosen this one 10mm bolt.
And then wiggle it right out.
Next, we're going to pull the battery box out. There are 4 13mm bolts to remove on the top part here. Alright, to get to the last 2 bolts on the bottom of the battery box, you have to remove the wheel well cover.
Gotta take out these 8mm bolts. They're kind of scattered in that wheel liner. Some of them are tricky to get to, and some of them are tricky to film.
Then you gotta pry this out and remove it out of the well. Okay, so now that the wheel well cover is removed, you can get the last 2 13mm bolts out of the bottom of the box.
And then pull these 3 Phillips head screws from this little bracket. Then go back up top, and you got a couple electrical connections for the washer pump and a few hoses. There's a hose on the bottom also, so be careful of that one.
Now we have these 2 little plastic clips that hold the radiator hose to the side of the engine compartment. Okay, so now we're going to work on removing the fan.
We're going to do a little need a tool, make a tool here. So we found a nut the same size. We're going to trace that out on a piece of steel. Cut that bad boy out. Ooh, that's good. Break it out. You know, can't get all the way in there with the angle grinder. Look at that, perfect fit. Nice.
So now we're going to pull the fan shroud out. It's held on with 4 13mm nuts. We actually put ours back on the threads so we don't lose them. And then here you're going to need to disconnect the fan clutch plug and pull this 10mm bolt out. Wiggle that a little bit, and then the whole shroud will pull out from the top. Next we're going to pull the fan off. We put a wood wedge in between these two pulleys here and tapped it in with a hammer. Careful not to hit anything else.
Then you get your fancy wrench that we made earlier. If you have the right size, that's handy dandy too, but I mean our wrench is pretty cool. Then you hit it with a hammer, and then when that doesn't work, you get a bigger hammer, and that normally works.
Once that is loose, you can just spin it off and lift it out.
Once you have your fan and clutch assembly out, bring it to a workbench or flat area where you won't damage any of the blades. Then remove the 6 13mm bolts.
Then you can lift the fan off the old clutch, put it onto the new clutch, and reinstall those 6 bolts. Here's a quick routing diagram we drew before removing the serpentine belt.
Or you can just look it up on the internet, like a real millennial.
So to get the serpentine belt off, you have to put a 1/2-inch drive ratchet into the belt tensioner and turn it clockwise, and then just pull the belt off of one of the pulleys and you're good to go.
After you remove the serpentine belt, you'll need to remove the idler and the tensioner pulleys. They're both 13mm bolts. Pretty easy to get to.
Now we're going to work on removing the accumulator. First we removed the 4 plastic, I believe they're some kind of a safety clip, off the joints on the AC lines.
So now you whip out your fancy little AC line removal tool. You stick the flared out end into the connection and wiggle the AC line off.
Then you're going to pull the 2 10mm bolts out of the accumulator that hold it to the firewall.
Then, using your little removal tool again, get the line off that goes into the firewall, and there you go. You got your accumulator out.
Next, we're going to remove the other AC line. I didn't get any footage of the end at the firewall, but it works pretty much the same as the rest. Insert the tool and then pull the lines apart. Now you can pull the AC compressor out. You will have to unplug it first. We didn't get any footage of that, but it's a 2-step plug. You have to pull the red slide out, but not completely, and then press on the black release as you pull the plug apart.
After you get that unplugged, you take out the last 10mm bolt holding on the AC line connection on the back of the compressor. Then remove the 4 13mm bolts holding the compressor to the block.
Next, we're going to remove the condenser. First, you have to pull the 2 AC lines off the passenger side of the condenser, and then remove the 4 bolts that hold it to the truck.
And don't forget to remove all the old O-rings and seals from all the AC lines you'll be reusing.
These 2 seals at the end came off the AC lines that connect to the back of the compressor. The new compressor came pre-filled with oil, which the instructions said to drain and replace. We pulled the back cap off and drained all we could from there, and also pulled the side plug out and drained that as well.
Now we're going to fill the oil back into the compressor. We got some PAG 100 oil. We're going to dump some into the back and then spin it around just a little bit so that we can get it moving and circulating. Then put that plug back on, and then we'll remove the side plug and fill some oil in there also. We used about 3/4 of the bottle just filling the compressor. We'll show you where we put the rest of it later.
So this is the little pressure release valve that couldn't stand the pressure. And then we reuse this little metal bracket onto the new compressor. Hey, just wanted to pop in here and mention that we didn't replace the evaporator. That's what's connected to those 2 ports on the firewall. But we did flush it out. And we also flushed out all the old AC lines that we reused. If you decide you want to do this, there are a few methods online that you can look up for how to do it.
Now we filled up the accumulator with about half the oil we had left over from filling up the compressor. We removed this little ring and wiped some oil on the O-rings just to make sure they don't get smashed.
Okay, now you can press the accumulator back into the port on the firewall and reinstall the 2 10mm bolts into the bracket.
Now we installed the old clip onto the new AC line as well as the old wire sleeving.
Then we oiled the O-rings as well as the port in the firewall and then press the fittings together. It'll probably take a little bit of wiggling to get it to properly seal.
Now we're going to connect the old line to the new line.
First, oil the old fitting and install 3 new O-rings.
Now oil both fittings and slide them together.
Okay, now we're going to make the final press connection on the AC lines. Yay! First, we're going to oil both fittings, one on the AC line and one on the accumulator.
Just wiggle together, and this is how it should look.
And finally, we clip the AC line back to the side of the engine compartment.
Then clipped the coolant overflow hose back to the AC line.
Then you can clip the plastic safety clips back on the connections of all the lines.
When unpacking your condenser coil, make sure when you take out the plugs, it hisses a little. This means that it has some pressure built up from when they pressure tested it at the factory.
Then thread the new studs in. Those are tightened with a 5mm wrench.
Now reinstall the 4 bolts holding in the condenser coil and tighten them up to proper torque specs. Then install the new O-rings and seals. Put a little bit of refrigerant oil on there just so they slide in nicely.
Now you're going to want to pull these plugs out, slide new seals on, then press the connections in and tighten the 13mm bolts back down. Here we're just making sure that all the bolts are nice and tight. And these little bolts were also loose, so give those a check. There's 8 of them.
Next, we drilled a small hole very carefully into the side of the condenser. When doing this, be really careful not to hit any sort of tubing or go too deep into the condenser.
We decided to start draining some of the radiator fluid out in order to be able to replace the water pump. You're going to want to keep an eye on this as it will fill a couple of buckets.
Now finagle the AC compressor back into place and tighten down all 4 bolts.
Now you're going to want to slide your new seals onto the back connection on the AC compressor. Tighten that connection back up, and also don't forget to plug the compressor back in.
After about 10 minutes, you have 4 gallons of Kool-Aid. Oops, I mean coolant. Don't drink it. It doesn't taste very good.
So we put the rest of the refrigerant oil into the line here. You have to hold down the little valve as you pour in.
Now we're going to replace the water pump. First, remove these 2 10mm bolts from the housing of the water pump, and then persuade it with a hammer if needed.
When you take the water pump out, notice the weep hole, this right here, is pointing down. That will leak if the bearing seal has failed on the water pump, which will tell you it's time to replace. After that, put the new water pump in and tighten the 2 bolts evenly to avoid cracking the casting.
Now install your new idler pulley, and then route the belt. We hired some squirrels to help us with this one. It was a lot easier with their help. We left the belt off of the power steering pump, so we had some slack in there. And then we installed the new tensioner pulley and tightened down the bolt.
I didn't film this part, but like before, use your 1/2-inch ratchet, release the tension on the tensioner, and slide the belt over the power steering pump.
Now reinstall the fan and fan shroud by sliding the fan shroud down and into its tabs, and then putting the bolts in it. Then tighten down the fan onto the fan pulley.
Then go ahead and tighten up the 4 nuts to hold the fan shroud on.
No, make it tight.
Oh, real tight. Now you need to route the fan clutch wire. Go ahead and remove this 10mm bolt. Slide the bracket into place. You might need to tap it into place with a hammer.
If it still doesn't go in, put a bigger hammer on it.
Then tighten that bolt. And we used a little electronics cleaner to clean the plug out and plug that in.
Refill as much coolant back into the radiator as possible. Later, when you start the engine, it will suck the rest back in.
This is also a great time to put new antifreeze in. Next, install the battery box. Before you get it all the way back in, don't forget to hook up the bottom hose on the washer pump. Then kind of wiggle it back into place. We hired a couple more squirrels to help us with this part. Then reconnect the hose on the back of the washer pump and also plug in the electrical connection. Then thread in the 4 bolts on top. Replace the 3 screws in the bottom of that bracket underneath. And finally, the last 2 bolts on the bottom side. Tighten everything up, and that's it.
Next, treating the battery like a small child, slide it into its diaper, and reinstall the plastic wedge.
Now you can reconnect the battery cables on both batteries.
Clip down the airbox and reinstall the 10mm nut. Torque to proper monkey wrench specifications and put the filter back in. Then clip the top half of the air box back on. And tighten down the hose clamp.
finally the last part. Yay! The last thing is to put the wheel well cover back on. I didn't film this part much, but it takes 8 10mm bolts, so as long as you put all those back in, you should be good. Now we're going to start the process of recharging the AC system. We borrowed this vacuum pump and gauge set from our local parts store.
Now that you've got your borrowed vacuum pump, connect your yellow hose from the gauges to the pump, and then connect the low side and then the high side to the system.
Now turn on your borrowed vacuum pump and open both valves on the gauges. We let the vacuum pump run for a couple of hours, then we shut it off and let the system sit overnight to check if it would hold vacuum, which it did. Yay!
Next, close the valves and disconnect the vacuum pump. Now connect the adapter to the end of the yellow hose and then the bottle of refrigerant onto the adapter. Tighten the valve to pierce the bottle and then open the valve again to release the refrigerant into the line. Bleed the line.
After we had finished up, we discovered that there is a valve underneath this cover cap for bleeding the line. This would definitely be a better way to go.
And open the valve. Then turn the truck on and set the AC as cold as it will go and high fan.
While you're filling the system, it might help to rotate the can from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And here's the tricky part. The AC compressor won't spin if the pressure in the system is too low. One can of Freon doesn't have enough pressure to trip the pressure sensor. So once the pressure equalizes, you need the compressor to spin in order to pull more Freon into the system. So what we did was manually spin the end of the compressor. That combined with the shaking of the can, we were able to get enough pressure and get the compressor to spin.
Now you can see the refrigerant flowing through the sight glass on the gauge manifold.
So once the first can is empty, you're going to need to close the valve, unscrew the first can, screw the second can on, puncture the seal, then unscrew the valve all the way, bleed the line, and open the valve again. And once again, it might help to shake the can from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock.
After a few minutes of charging with the second bottle, open the high side to check all the pressures. You will notice the pressure on the high side rise until the fan clutch engages. This pulls more air through the condenser coil, which causes the refrigerant to cool, thus dropping the pressure.
This is how it should work. The reason we believe our system failed is the fan clutch stopped working, which caused the pressure to reach a critical level, which eventually blew the pressure release on the AC compressor. Now for the third can of Freon. We only took 6 ounces out of the can to reach our 30-ounce capacity. To measure the amount we took out, we unscrewed the line from the adapter and weighed the can and adapter to determine the weight we needed to hit to get 6 ounces out. Then, like before, attach the third can, puncture, unscrew, bleed the line, open the low pressure side, and rotate the can for a couple of minutes.
You will need to check the weight regularly to get the last 6 ounces out. Be sure to screw the pin in all the way before disconnecting the hose from the adapter. You will have to bleed the hose after each time you disconnect the adapter.
Then, after you have 30 ounces in the system, go ahead and close all the valves, screw the pin on the can all the way in, and disconnect the line off the adapter. Leaving the adapter on the can will keep you from losing the rest of the Freon. Then disconnect both lines from the vehicle and reinstall the caps.
Back these off all the way. That releases the Schrader valve.
So that's it. After completing this repair, our AC was back up and running nice and cool, and everything else is working just fine. If you have any other questions, feel free to post them in the comments below. If you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Hope this helps somebody, and I'll see you in the next one.